So Dick Smith has put his money where his mouth is and produced a manifesto for a change to Australian public policy. He's also funded an advertising campaign and offered up to $2 million to political candidates who sign up to limiting Australia's population growth. Let's take a look at the ad.
We're told that endless economic growth is the solution to all our problems.
It's all about economic growth.
In a big Australia.
Well, you go for growth.
Australia needs growth.
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 Growth. This is about growth.
But what if growth is the problem? Endless growth is the way of a cancer cell growing forever until it kills the host that sustains it. That's the path we're on today. Our growth-addicted economic system will see our children living in a world of 11 billion people, consuming and polluting more than our finite planet can withstand. It's a path to either more and more inequality or famine, disaster, war, and collapse. Are we that stupid?
It's time to choose a new path without the insanity of endless growth. Australia can lead the way. Google Dick Smith, fair go. Authorised by Dick Smith, Terry Hills.
Grim stuff, but you see, Dick's ad campaign suffers from one little problem. Facts. Now recall what he said there about the consequences of rapid population growth.
It's a path to either more and more inequality or famine, disaster, war, and collapse. Are we that stupid?
Well, how do you explain this then, Dick? In 1970, the global population was about 3.7 billion, with approximately 60% or 2.2 billion living in extreme poverty. Then in just 45 years, the global population doubled and the number of people living in extreme poverty fell by 2/3. At the exact same time, world population growth ratcheted up, poverty came tumbling down. In 1980, the World Bank said 44% of the world population was living in poverty. Today, that's less than 10%. Now, no doubt Dick Smith is right when he says the planet is finite and there is a limit to growth. But when he talks about more and more inequality, currently the trend is less and less globally. This is fear-mongering, plain and simple. But the ad campaign doesn't address any of his proposals for Australia, and for that we need to go to his 20-page manifesto. And as you can see, straight out of the gate, he's ratcheting up the fear with this picture and the caption, "Typical Australian City Scene 2050?" Probably more accurate to say Antifa 2017. But the headline above is one of Dick's big gripes. Australia's wealthiest 1% own more than the bottom 70%. That's 17 million Aussies. Now, my guess is that you're supposed to find that statistic disturbing. I don't. For a start, it's a nonsense statistic. It treats people as members of static groups. The fact is there is a lot of turnover in the top 1%. Some people fall out while others move in, and the people at the bottom don't stay at the bottom. He makes this mistake multiple times in the manifesto. On page 7 he notes, "The figures show that not only is there incredible wealth inequality in this country, but income inequality is increasing. Between 1988 and 2011, the poorest 10% of Australians received an increase in income of about 3%, while the richest 10% increased income growth of more than 28%. This is unfair. In the past, it would even be considered un-Australian." Again, this is just economic illiteracy. The poorest 10% in 1988 are not the same people as the poorest 10% in 2011, nor are the richest 10% the same people. People move in and out of those categories over time. It's called social mobility. And here's a quick primer on social mobility in the US context to demonstrate what I mean. So as you can see, almost 2/3 of Americans born into the bottom 20%, that is an annual income of less than $11,239, make it out of that category by age 40. But more than 1/3 stay in the bottom 20%. Also note, for those born in the top 20%, an annual income of $178,000, less than a third manage to stay there, and 11% actually fall into the lowest 20%. So just because you're born into a high-income family doesn't mean you'll necessarily stay there. And just out of interest, look what happens if your mother is continuously married and you're born in the bottom 20%. You have a slightly better chance of moving to any other category, including the top 20%, than staying in the bottom 20%. And see what happens if your mother was never married. Only a 5% chance of moving into the top 20% and a 50% chance of staying in the bottom 20%. I wish governments would pay more attention to that data before praising those stunning and brave single mothers. Anyway, how does Australia stack up when it comes to social mobility? Well, not too bad. As you can see on the vertical scale, Australia is better than 9 of these OECD countries and worse than 6. On income equality, Australia is about in the middle. The USA has the worst of both worlds, low mobility and high income inequality. So I'm not really buying Smith's argument here. And how about this graph on page 2 of the manifesto? Very misleading. He hasn't even compared over the same time period. The graph on the left is real net disposable income per capita, which declined 3% in 4 years, which is obviously not very good. But he compares that to the wealth of billionaires over a 6-year period, presumably because up to 2015 didn't prove his point well enough. Also, the billionaire list suffers from selection bias. It doesn't count those billionaires that fell off the list because they lost money. They just get replaced by new billionaires. For example, Nathan Tinkler had a net worth of $1.2 billion in 2011, but by 2015 he was on the verge of bankruptcy and he was declared bankrupt in 2016. Frank Timmis went from $1 billion to $250 million. Also, I double-checked Smith's numbers, and whilst I could match the number he got for 2017, I got a much higher number for 2011. Smith's number looks like it's approximately $55 billion. Interestingly, the top 10 billionaires in 2011 totaled $55.5 billion. So I think Dick Smith has understated the starting point. Anyway, in 2011, there were actually 35 billionaires. 3 have since died, but only 2 had died as of 2015. So of those 33 still alive, their net worth had increased 9.7% over the 4-year period 2011 to 2015. Not quite as dramatic as Dick's 195% claim. Now, the other big issue Dick Smith tackles is population growth, and the key focus here is on decreasing immigration. He wants to return immigration to the long-term average of 70,000 per annum from the current approximately 200,000. The government has already committed to 190,000 this year and for the next 3 years after that. So this is the part I can get on board with. We should at least halve the number from the current intake. Why? Well, as Judith Sloan pointed out in The Australian a couple of weeks ago, more than 85% of recent migrants settled in Sydney or Melbourne, which puts obvious pressure on infrastructure, amenity, and the cost of living more generally, in particular housing and rents. But the part here I do disagree with is that he wants to up the humanitarian program from currently about 15,000 to 20,000. These are the people who find it the most difficult to find work and fit into society and are more likely to be a drain on the welfare system. But reducing immigration is definitely a good idea. But to address Dick's inequality argument, he's proposing what I think are policies that would be extremely detrimental to the Australian economy. You see, Dick has become a redistributionist and a fan of the big state. Smith wants to raise the company tax rate from 30 to 45%, which would make Australia one of the highest tax countries in the world. His argument is that when he started out in the 1970s, the company tax rate was 50%. But Dick hasn't realised that the rest of the world is not stuck in the 1970s. Imagine the capital flight from this country if we significantly raised corporate tax rates. How are you going to attract foreign investment? We already have the highest energy costs in the world. But wait, there's even more. He wants to raise the highest personal income tax bracket from the already high 49 to 65%. Oh yeah, that's fantastic. That won't disincentivize people to earn more. He also wants to name and shame the top 1% by having them publish their tax returns, and he wants an inheritance tax on the wealthiest 1%. To me, an inheritance tax is just a form of double taxation, and I think it's a good thing we don't have one here in Australia. But more importantly, I don't trust the government to spend all this imaginary extra money wisely. They already spend too much of our money. Thanks very much. He also wants to get rid of capital gains tax concessions, which will surely have the effect of discouraging long-term investment in assets. Now, there are some good proposals about closing tax loopholes and prohibiting the use of tax havens. But if you want companies and high-income earners to pay a higher percentage of tax than they do now by minimising tax avoidance, then at least give them an incentive on the other side by lowering tax rates. Smith wants to both close loopholes and raise tax rates, and that would be horrendous. I suspect the top 1% will be looking for alternative tax jurisdictions, and after a few years of this economic madness, we're sure to get a visit from the ghost of Paul Keating.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
Now, if you want to put more money in the pockets of low-income earners, you don't have to punish the rich to do it. How about just letting taxpayers keep more of what they earn? Currently in Australia, no one pays tax on the first $18,200 worth of income, but Senator David Leyonhjelm of the Liberal Democrats is proposing to extend that tax-free threshold to $40,000 and then apply a flat 20% tax on every dollar earned after that.
You can see the scale of the tax cuts, the current system versus David's proposal. David's proposal is the dark line there, and the red line's the current system. Yeah. And just to give you a guide to some of the savings, people earning $80,000 a year, it's a $10,000 tax cut. $100,000 a year, $17,000, and $140,000, not a huge income in places like Sydney and Melbourne. It's a $23,000 per annum tax cut. So you're talking the real deal here.
Yes, that's right. And the basis of this is that you can use that money more productively, more effectively than the government can. When the government is handing out money to people it likes or people it thinks need it or spending it on things, they don't spend the money anywhere near as efficiently as we do when it's our own money. We're careful about what we buy with our money, and we get better value for it.
So currently someone earning $40,000 pays just over $4,500 in tax. Under the LDP's plan, that would mean an extra $380 in your pocket every month. And I'm sure high income earners wouldn't care about closing loopholes if they know they'll never pay more than 20 cents on the dollar in tax. Of course, to pay for those large tax cuts, you need to significantly cut government spending. And that for me is an even more enticing prospect than more money in my pocket. Anyway, there are more proposals in Dick Smith's plan, but apart from the reduction in immigration, there's very little to recommend in this manifesto. And in my opinion, if all the redistributionist policies were implemented, Australia would be committing economic suicide. So do you think Dick Smith's manifesto will deliver a fair go for all Australians, or is his fair go a no-go? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.